All right, guys, buckle up. Because what you're about to hear is one of the biggest plot twists in modern economic history. This isn't just about smartphones or internet networks. It's about how one company, Huawei, turned what was supposed to be a death sentence into a springboard for a trillion-dollar technology revolution. In 2019, Washington thought it had a masterstroke. Blacklist Huawei, cut off its access to American technology, and watch it crumble. The belief was that America's technological grip was so strong, so absolute, that no company, no matter how ambitious, could survive without it. But the strategy backfired. What the US intended as a clean kill turned into a chain reaction, one that accelerated China's entire technological independence and left the West scrambling to adapt. This is the story of how sanctions designed to bury Huawei ended up reshaping the global tech order. The story begins in May 2019, when the US Department of Commerce officially placed Huawei on the Entity List. That decision meant American suppliers, companies like Qualcomm, Intel, Broadcom, and Google, were suddenly forbidden from doing business with Huawei without special licenses. This wasn't a light slap on the wrist. Washington described it as a death blow. US policymakers were convinced that Huawei was so deeply dependent on American chips and Google's Android ecosystem that it would collapse within months. Analysts at the time echoed the same sentiment. Reports from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Wall Street Journal predicted Huawei's global business would soon disintegrate, dragging down China's broader technology ambitions with it. The numbers seemed to justify that confidence. Huawei's smartphones relied on American components for nearly half of their parts. Its flagship devices ran on Google's Android system, which was critical for international users. Cut off the chips and cut off Android, and you cut off Huawei's oxygen supply. That was the thinking in Washington. But while American policymakers were celebrating their bold move, Huawei was already executing a very different playbook. The company had anticipated trouble years in advance. Throughout 2018, as trade tensions escalated, Huawei quietly spent billions stockpiling critical chips and components. By the time sanctions officially landed, Huawei had built up an inventory large enough to keep its factories running for almost 2 years. This wasn't just a clever insurance policy, it was a tactical cushion that bought time. Time to accelerate research, time to push backup projects out of the shadows, time to turn crisis into opportunity. One of the most important of those backup projects was chip design. Huawei's semiconductor arm, HiSilicon, immediately pushed forward, and within months, the company unveiled the Kirin 990 processor. At first, it was still fabricated by Taiwan's TSMC, but it dramatically reduced Huawei's reliance on foreign chip suppliers. At the same time, Huawei pulled another ace from its sleeve, Harmony OS. This was a homegrown operating system that had been quietly in development since 2012. Initially, it was more of a side project, but sanctions turned it into the company's lifeline. Huawei accelerated its rollout, and within 18 months, over 200 million devices inside China were running Harmony OS. Customers embraced it, not just as a functional alternative, but as a statement of defiance. The message was clear: Huawei didn't need Google to survive. What was supposed to be the company's downfall became a rallying point for innovation, and this is where Washington made its second major miscalculation. Policymakers had underestimated something far more powerful than technology itself: national pride. When Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, was detained in Canada at the request of the US, the move was seen across China as a national humiliation. Instead of discouraging consumers, it galvanized them. Buying Huawei products became an act of patriotism. Overnight, Huawei stopped being just a brand. It became a symbol of sovereignty, a corporate flag for the country. Western analysts, looking at balance sheets and dependency ratios, couldn't measure that kind of loyalty. But inside China, it transformed Huawei into something untouchable. While Huawei was regaining its footing, something else was happening on the global stage. US carriers like Verizon and AT&T were struggling to deliver on their promises of 5G. Rollouts were delayed, coverage was spotty, and customers were frustrated. Meanwhile, Huawei pushed ahead with infrastructure investments few outside China even noticed. By 2024, it unveiled its so-called 5.5G networks, boasting lightning-fast speeds of up to 10 gigabits per second, ultra-low latency, and advanced AI-driven optimization. Within a year and a half, Huawei had deployed this technology across dozens of Chinese cities and expanded into international markets from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. American consumers, still stuck with inconsistent 5G, were left wondering why one of the most advanced economies on Earth couldn't keep pace. Huawei wasn't just catching up anymore, it was setting the pace. Inside Huawei's leadership, the thinking was also evolving. Reports emerged of something called Project Delete America. Whether or not that was the actual internal name, the strategy behind it was unmistakable. Purge all reliance on American software, hardware, and code by 2025. This wasn't just corporate posturing. Huawei rolled out a new enterprise management system called Meta ERP, built entirely without Oracle, Microsoft, or SAP. By early 2025, its Harmony OS captured a huge chunk of China's smartphone market, and its own processors started replacing NVIDIA GPUs in domestic data centers. Even if the rhetoric sounded extreme, the outcome was clear. Huawei was systematically removing every American dependency from its ecosystem. Beijing quickly recognized what was happening. Huawei's resilience wasn't just good for one company, it was a blueprint for the nation. Under the Made in China 2025 strategy, the government poured vast amounts of funding into semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure. Estimates suggest more than $1 trillion were mobilized across critical sectors, accelerating a nationwide drive toward self-sufficiency. Huawei became the model: survive sanctions, innovate internally, and then dominate globally. And dominate it did. In August 2024, Huawei launched the Mate 60 Pro, powered by its own 7-nanometer processor. Within just a few months, it clawed back significant market share in China's premium smartphone segment, toppling Apple from its #1 spot in some regions. Qualcomm, once the dominant supplier of high-end chips in China, saw its revenues collapse. The shockwaves didn't stop at smartphones. Across Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Huawei-branded devices surged in sales, positioning themselves as cheaper, reliable alternatives to Western products. Faced with this resurgence, Washington tried a new tactic: tariffs. In early 2025, a sweeping 145% tariff on Chinese tech imports was announced. The idea was to crush consumer demand for Huawei, Xiaomi, and Lenovo products. But once again, the move backfired. Prices of laptops and consumer electronics in the US spiked. Retailers panicked, consumers complained, job losses loomed in the electronics sector. Under mounting pressure, the administration quietly rolled back some exemptions, effectively acknowledging that the US couldn't afford to cut itself off from Chinese technology. What was intended as a show of strength became a showcase of dependence. By this point, the numbers told their own story. A growing percentage of laptops and smartphones sold in the US contained key Chinese-made components. Billions in subsidies were poured into American chip fabrication plants. Yet many of those facilities still relied on Chinese vendors for equipment. Instead of decoupling, the tech war had only deepened the entanglement. What Washington framed as leverage was now turning into vulnerability. The bigger picture here is staggering. This isn't just the story of Huawei. It's the story of how sanctions intended to kill a company ended up accelerating an entire nation's technological revolution. Huawei became the template, and now other Chinese giants, whether in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, or quantum computing, are following the same path. The ripple effects are global. Nations across the developing world are looking at Huawei and asking, why depend on the West when China is offering an alternative? The longer this goes on, the more normalized Chinese technology becomes in global markets, eroding what was once uncontested Western dominance. And here's the part that should keep policymakers in Washington awake at night. This fight isn't limited to hardware anymore. China is extending its strategy into fintech, digital currencies, and global payment networks. If these systems take hold internationally, they could weaken the very foundation of U.S. economic power, the dominance of the dollar in global trade. Huawei's survival was the opening move. The real game is about control of the technological and financial architecture of the 21st century. So here's the question. Did U.S. sanctions against Huawei win a battle but lose the war? Instead of crippling China's tech industry, they ignited it. What was supposed to be Huawei's downfall became its rebirth. And as a result, the balance of innovation is shifting eastward, faster than anyone in Washington ever imagined. If this trend continues, America may find itself in a position it hasn't faced in over a century, no longer the undisputed global leader in technology. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that like button, share it with someone who follows global tech and geopolitics, and make sure you subscribe. Because what's coming next makes Huawei's comeback look like just the beginning. The fight isn't over. In fact, it's only just starting, and the consequences are going to be massive.